hum of voices filled the jet bridge, a mix of impatience and excitement as passengers filed into the plane. Patricia Coleman walked with her chin slightly raised, her designer heels clicking against the carpeted aisle, her leather handbag swinging at her side like a badge of status. She had done this routine hundreds of times, first class only, never economy, never the middle seat. In her world, comfort was not a luxury, but a right, one she expected to be acknowledged without question. As she reached row 9, her eyes fell on something that made her brows knit together. A little black boy, no older than 9, stood in the aisle holding out a boarding pass with both hands. His backpack, worn at the edges, hung heavily from one shoulder. He wasn't fidgeting like most children would. He wasn't even asking for help. Instead, he quietly looked down at the number printed on the ticket, then back up at the seat. 9A, the seat Patricia had already chosen in her mind. The seat she had been eyeing since she first booked the flight. Patricia gave a small laugh, the kind that came from the throat rather than the heart. "Oh no, sweetheart," she said, her voice dripping with forced sweetness, loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear. "You must be mistaken. This is first class." She adjusted the strap of her handbag, letting the gold clasp shine under the cabin lights as if it carried proof of her claim. The boy's dark eyes lifted slowly to hers. He didn't speak right away. He simply extended the boarding pass forward with steady hands, his small fingers trembling ever so slightly. There was something unsettling about his calm. Children usually argued, pleaded, or looked for an adult when challenged, but not this boy. He simply waited. Patricia waved a manicured hand dismissively. "Darling, I know it says something on your ticket, but the airline must have made an error. Tai. These things happen all the time. They'll find you another seat somewhere more appropriate." She slid gracefully into 9A, smoothing her skirt and setting her handbag firmly on the empty seat beside her, as if she were staking her claim. Around them, a few heads turned. A businessman across the aisle frowned but said nothing. An elderly couple whispered to each other, shaking their heads. The flight attendants further up the cabin exchanged glances, sensing tension but not yet stepping in. The boy adjusted his backpack strap and stood there, silent. His expression did not change, but his eyes, steady, unblinking, held something far beyond his years. Patricia shifted uncomfortably in her seat. For a brief second, she felt as though he was studying her, not with anger, not even with sadness, but with a strange patience that made her throat tighten. "Well," she demanded, her voice a touch sharper now, "why are you looking at me like that? Where are your parents? Surely they know this seat isn't yours." The boy finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm, every word deliberate. "This is my seat, ma'am. My boarding pass says 9A. He paused, glancing at the paper again before holding it out toward her. "Would you like to see it?" His politeness stung her more than defiance would have. Patricia leaned back, crossing her arms. "No need. I'll call the attendant. They'll handle this properly." Her finger pressed the service button with practiced entitlement, the soft chime echoing through the cabin. Passengers watched in silence. Some looked away, too uncomfortable to intervene. Others stared openly, waiting to see what would happen next. And there he stood, the boy, small yet unyielding, gripping his backpack like a shield, his calm presence heavy enough to fill the entire aisle. Patricia's smirk faltered. That steady gaze unsettled her in ways she could not explain. It was not the look of a child begging for acceptance. It was something else, something that suggested he already knew exactly how this story would end. The air in the cabin grew still, charged with an unspoken tension. And for the first time in years, Patricia Coleman, the woman who thought she owned every room she entered, felt a flicker of unease as she sat in a seat that did not belong to her. The seatbelt signs flickered above as more passengers settled in, but all eyes seemed drawn to row 9. Whispers traveled like a current through the cabin, low murmurs that carried judgment, yet no one dared speak aloud. Patricia Coleman straightened her posture, letting her diamond bracelet catch the light as she crossed her arms with practiced superiority. She had done this before, claimed authority through confidence, through tone, through a refusal to bend. In her mind, the matter was settled. The child would be moved, the staff would apologize, and she would sip her champagne before takeoff. Yet the boy did not move. He stood there, still holding his boarding pass, the paper crumpling slightly at the edges from his tight grip. His backpack dangled at his side, but his shoulders remained squared. His silence was louder than any protest could have been. His dark eyes stayed fixed on Patricia, calm yet unyielding, and it unnerved her more than she wanted to admit. Children were supposed to fuss, to cry, to look for rescue. But this boy just waited. A businessman across the aisle leaned closer to his wife and whispered, "That's his seat, poor kid." His wife gave a small shake of her head, her lips pressed tight. A young woman 2 rows ahead pretended to read her magazine, but her eyes flickered constantly toward the scene. Everyone saw it, everyone knew, but no one moved. Patricia smirked, lifting her chin. "Don't look at me like that, sweetheart. Mistakes happen. You'll be fine back there where kids usually sit." Her voice dripped with a condescension so thick it made the elderly woman in row 10 let out an audible gasp. The boy finally spoke softly, almost as if speaking to himself. "My nanny helped me find my seat. She's back there now, in economy." His words were calm, almost too calm, carrying the weight of someone used to explaining himself to people who never truly listened. Patricia laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that made a few passengers shift uncomfortably. "Economy? Well, that makes sense. That's where you belong, darling. There's more room for you to play back there anyway." She flipped her hair off her shoulder and reached into her handbag as though the conversation was over. But it wasn't. The boy's silence stretched again, pressing into her like a weight. He didn't argue. He didn't pout. He just stood there with that strange serenity, as though he knew something no one else in the cabin could see. Patricia's throat felt dry, though she would never admit it. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Why are you staring at me like that? Do you think you scare me? You don't. You're just a child." He tilted his head slightly, studying her with unsettling patience. "Ma'am, I'm not trying to scare you, I'm just waiting for the truth to catch up." The words pierced the air. Passengers blinked, startled by the boy's maturity. Patricia's smirk faltered. Her fingers tightened around her handbag strap. She opened her mouth to retort, but the ding of the service button above cut through the tension as the flight attendant approached, her smile tight, her eyes nervous. "Is there a problem here?" the attendant asked, her gaze moving between the elegant woman in the seat and the small boy standing firmly in the aisle. Patricia leaned back with exaggerated ease, gesturing toward the child with a dismissive wave. "Yes, there's a problem. This little one seems confused. He thinks this seat is his." Her voice dripped with self-assured authority, expecting instant agreement. The boy extended his boarding pass once more, his small hand steady now. The attendant took it carefully, her eyes scanning the ticket, and then her brow furrowed. Her eyes flickered back to the seat number, then to the boy, then back to the seat. The pause was too long, too careful, and the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Something was wrong. Something Patricia couldn't see yet. The boy remained silent, calm as ever, while Patricia's smirk returned for a moment. She was sure the attendant would find a neat solution, send the boy away, restore the order of her world. But when the attendant looked up again, her voice faltered. "Ma'am, this boarding pass does indeed say seat 9A. The air in the cabin shifted. Patricia's smile froze on her lips, brittle and strained, and the boy, still silent, still patient, watched her as though he had been waiting for this exact moment all along. The flight attendant's fingers lingered on the boarding pass longer than necessary. Her polite smile wavered, replaced by something more cautious, more guarded. She cleared her throat softly, as if buying time, her eyes darting from the ticket to Patricia and back again. The hush that fell over first class was deafening, broken only by the rustle of newspapers and the faint hiss of the air conditioning above. Patricia Coleman leaned forward, her lips curling into a smirk. "Well, surely you see the mistake. Fix it and find him another seat." She tapped her manicured nails on the armrest, impatience dripping from each click. The attendant swallowed, her eyes shifting nervously to the boy. Daniel remained perfectly still, his small hands clasped in front of him, his backpack strap slipping slightly off one shoulder. He didn't flinch, he didn't plead. Instead, his calm eyes followed the attendant's movements with quiet certainty, as though he had seen this play out before. The attendant hesitated, lowering her voice. "There's a note on this reservation." Patricia raised a brow, at her laugh sharp and brittle. "A note? What could a child's ticket possibly say? That he needs crayons and milk with his dinner?" A few nearby passengers winced at her cruelty, but no one spoke. The attendant straightened, her tone tightening with professionalism. "Ma'am, I'll need to verify this with the captain." Patricia blinked, momentarily thrown. "The captain? For a child's ticket?" She scoffed, gesturing with both hands. "This is ridiculous. You don't need to bother the captain with this nonsense. He's busy preparing for the flight." But the attendant was already moving briskly toward the cockpit, boarding pass in hand. A murmur swept through the cabin. Passengers glanced at one another, some shaking their heads, some leaning closer to whisper. The elderly woman in row 10 whispered to her husband, I told you something was wrong. Patricia's pulse quickened, though she forced her face into an expression of exaggerated calm. She adjusted her handbag, smoothing her skirt as though nothing was out of place. Yet her heart beat faster, thudding against her ribs in an uncomfortable rhythm. Daniel shifted slightly, adjusting the strap of his backpack, but his face betrayed no anxiety. His expression was one of quiet composure, his dark eyes focused not on Patricia, but on the aisle ahead, where the attendant had disappeared. He seemed to be waiting, not for justice, not even for vindication, but for something inevitable. Patricia cleared her throat. Well, she said louder than necessary, addressing no one in particular. Clearly the airline is in chaos. This kind of incompetence never used to happen. Standards have dropped, I tell you. She let out a short laugh, expecting agreement, but the silence that followed pressed against her like a wall. The businessman across the aisle muttered under his breath, "Unbelievable." His wife elbowed him to stay quiet, but the word had already reached Patricia's ears. She flushed, her smirk faltering for the briefest moment. Then, movement. The flight attendant returned, and this time she wasn't alone. At her side walked Captain Rodriguez, tall and composed, his crisp uniform immaculate, his face unreadable. The low chatter in the cabin died instantly. Passengers straightened, eyes wide. It was rare, almost unheard of, for the captain himself to leave the cockpit before departure. Patricia's throat tightened, but she forced another laugh, sharp and hollow. "Oh, good. Finally someone with authority. I'm glad you've come to sort this out. This child is clearly in the wrong place, and I have an important meeting in Miami to prepare for." She leaned back into her seat, her confidence swelling again like a tide. But Captain Rodriguez didn't look at her. Not at first. His eyes went straight to Daniel, studying him with a brief flicker of recognition and respect. Patricia noticed, and for the first time, a thin strand of unease wound its way through her chest. The cabin seemed to shrink as Captain Rodriguez stepped into the aisle, his presence commanding without a single word. The murmurs died, replaced by a stillness that made the hum of the engine sound louder than usual. He carried the boarding pass in one hand, his eyes calm but sharp, the eyes of a man who had seen countless disputes, yet knew this one was different. Patricia straightened in seat 9A, lifting her chin with practiced elegance. "Finally," she said, her tone dripping with relief and superiority. "I'm glad you've come. This child is sitting in the wrong seat and your staff has been utterly incompetent in handling it. I trust you'll resolve this quickly." She adjusted her diamond bracelet, letting it catch the cabin light as though it validated her words. But the captain didn't turn to her. His gaze stayed on Daniel. The boy stood quietly, his backpack strap slipping again from his shoulder, his eyes steady and unblinking. The captain's expression softened, just barely, as he inclined his head toward the child in a subtle gesture of acknowledgement. It wasn't the way one looks at a mistake or a disruption. It was the way one looks at someone important. Patricia noticed, and for the first time, the certainty in her chest faltered. "Ma'am," Captain Rodriguez finally said, turning his attention to her, "this passenger's boarding pass is valid. Seat 9A is his." His voice was even, professional, but there was an edge of something else, a restraint, as though he were carefully choosing each word. Patricia's laugh rang out, brittle and forced. "Captain, please, you can't be serious. He's a child. Surely the system made an error. I've been flying first class for 25 years, and never once have I seen—" She paused, lowering her voice but not enough to be discreet. "Someone like him sitting here." Gasps rippled softly through the cabin. A man in row 8 turned fully in his seat, glaring at her. An elderly woman shook her head in disgust. But Patricia pressed on, desperate to reclaim control. The captain's jaw tightened. His eyes flickered toward Daniel again before returning to Patricia. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "this is not a system error. And I must remind you, our aircraft is equipped with audio surveillance. Everything you say is recorded." Patricia blinked, stunned for a moment. Then she scoffed. "Oh, so now you're accusing me of something? I'm simply pointing out the obvious. Look at him. Look at me. Does it really make sense that—" Her words cut off as Daniel lifted his head, his voice breaking through the heavy silence. "Ma'am," he said softly, "have you ever lost someone important?" The cabin froze. Even Patricia, caught mid-gesture, stilled. Her eyes darted to him, startled. "What kind of question is that?" she demanded, her voice sharper than she intended. Daniel's gaze didn't waver. His small hands tightened slightly on his backpack strap, but his voice remained steady, calm in a way that didn't belong to a child his age. "My mother died 2 years ago. She taught me something before she left. She said when people treat you badly, you should never forget your dignity. She told me respect is worth more than money or power." A heavy silence settled over the cabin. Several passengers looked away, their eyes shining. The businessman across the aisle muttered, "Unbelievable," but this time it wasn't aimed at the boy. Patricia felt the weight of every eye on her, and for the first time, her practiced smirk trembled. She tried to recover, leaning forward with a cruel smile. "That's a touching story," she sneered, "but it doesn't change the fact that you don't belong here. Perhaps your mother should have taught you about knowing your place." The words landed like stones dropped in still water. Gasps filled the cabin, sharper now, unmistakable. A woman in row 10 whispered, "How horrible." Someone else muttered, "Shameful." But Daniel didn't flinch. He straightened his shoulders, his eyes locked on Patricia's with an intensity that made her lean back despite herself. "You're right," he said, his voice low but firm. "My mother did teach me about knowing my place. She said my place is anywhere I have a right to be, and she told me never to let anyone's fear or ignorance take that away." The cabin fell utterly silent, the kind of silence that presses against your chest. Patricia's lips parted, but no sound came out. For the first time, the certainty in her eyes flickered into something else, doubt. And as the captain stood quietly by, his hand resting on the boarding pass, the balance in the room shifted. The child Patricia had dismissed was no longer the quiet figure she thought she could brush aside. He was something else entirely. Something she was only beginning to fear. The air inside the cabin was thick, almost oppressive, as if the airy walls of the plane were holding their breath. Patricia Coleman sat stiffly in seat 9A, her diamond bracelet no longer sparkling, but heavy against her wrist. Her smirk had faded, replaced by the faintest twitch of unease tugging at her lips. Around her, passengers stared, not at her, but at the boy she had tried so hard to dismiss. Daniel stood steady in the aisle, his small figure framed by the soft glow of the cabin lights. He was only 9, yet the way he held himself carried the weight of someone much older. His eyes, dark and calm, didn't burn with anger or shimmer with tears. They held something deeper, something far more unsettling for Patricia. Dignity. "I don't understand why you're all looking at me like that," Patricia said suddenly, her voice sharp, breaking the silence. She looked around, her tone rising with a desperate edge. "He's just a child. This is first class. There are rules. There are standards. What is happening to this airline?" Her words fell flat. No one nodded in agreement. Instead, the silence stretched until it became unbearable. Daniel shifted his backpack onto both shoulders now, freeing his hands. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "my mother told me that respect is not something you give only to people who look like you or dress like you or live like you. She said respect is for everyone, because dignity doesn't cost anything, but losing it costs everything." The words landed like a stone in water, rippling through the cabin. An older man in the front row lowered his newspaper, his jaw tight. The elderly woman in row 10 dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Even the flight attendant, still standing close by, swallowed hard, her professional mask cracking with emotion. Patricia let out a harsh laugh, brittle and hollow. "What an inspiring little speech," she said, leaning back in the seat. "But life doesn't work that way. You'll see when you grow up. Some people are born to serve, and some people are born to lead. That's just reality." Gasps rose around her, louder this time, sharp and cutting. The businessman across the aisle turned fully now, his face flushed with anger. "Ma'am, that is unacceptable," he snapped, his voice carrying across the rows. Patricia blinked, startled by the open rebuke. For the first time, her certainty began to falter in public, not just in her mind. Her cheeks flushed hot, but her pride forced her to hold her chin higher. Daniel didn't waver. His eyes never left hers. "My mother told me something else too," he said, his voice calm but heavier now, the words deliberate. "She said when someone tries to take away your place, don't fight with anger. Just stand. Stand until the truth shows itself. Because the truth always does." Something in his voice cut deeper than any argument could have. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't rebellion. It was certainty. Patricia shifted in her seat, suddenly uncomfortable. That calm gaze, the boy's refusal to crack, to cry, to fit the role she was trying to shove him into, made her throat tighten. It was as though the child was not resisting her, but outlasting her. Passengers leaned closer now, no longer whispering, but watching openly. The balance in the cabin had shifted. What had started as a simple power play over a seat had become something larger, something Patricia couldn't control anymore. The captain's voice broke the silence at last, low and steady. "Ms. Coleman, I suggest you lower your voice." Patricia froze. It wasn't just a suggestion, it was a warning. Daniel, however, only gave the faintest smile, a small, quiet curve of the lips that spoke not of victory, but of patience. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't forcing anything. He was simply waiting for the truth to arrive, as if he already knew it was on its way. And that smile, that calm certainty from a child she had dismissed as powerless, sent a shiver down Patricia Coleman's spine. The cabin door at the front of first class opened again, and the murmur of voices quieted instantly. A tall man in a navy vest and polished shoes stepped in with the steady air of someone used to solving problems. James Morrison, the airline's flight supervisor, had worked the skies for 15 years. He had seen disputes over armrests, champagne, and luggage, but nothing quite like this. Nothing that made every passenger sit on edge, watching like a silent jury. Patricia Coleman sat up straighter in seat 9A, relief flashing in her eyes. Finally, she declared, her voice dripping with vindication. Someone with actual authority. Please, Mr. Whatever your name is, do your job and remove this child. He's clearly sitting where he doesn't belong. She gestured with her hand like a queen demanding servants obey. James didn't move toward Patricia. Instead, he turned his head to the boy still standing quietly in the aisle. His expression softened, just barely, as his eyes met Daniel's. For the briefest moment, there was recognition in his gaze, respect, something Patricia failed to notice. Ms. Coleman, James began evenly, his tone calm but edged with steel. Before we make any decisions, I need to verify a few details. Patricia laughed, a sharp, condescending sound that made several passengers flinch. Details? There's nothing to verify. Look at him. Do you honestly believe a boy like that can afford to sit here? He's obviously mistaken, or worse, someone upgraded him out of pity. Either way, he doesn't belong in first class. The businessman across the aisle shifted uncomfortably, muttering under his breath, "Unbelievable." James didn't look at her. He turned back to Daniel instead. "Would you mind if I hold on to your boarding pass just a moment longer, young man?" Neil nodded politely and handed it over without hesitation. His calmness unsettled Patricia more than defiance ever could. She tapped her foot against the floor, her frustration bubbling beneath the surface. James studied the ticket carefully, then looked back at Patricia. His expression was still professional, but his voice was firmer now. "Ms. Coleman, I need to remind you that all conversations in this cabin are recorded. Everything you say is logged as part of our security system." Patricia blinked, startled. "Recorded? What does that have to do with anything? I'm simply pointing out the obvious. This is a mistake. I refuse to be humiliated by your staff's incompetence." She waved her hand dismissively as though she could brush aside his warning. But James's eyes hardened. "What I've heard so far crosses into discrimination, ma'am. Suggesting someone doesn't belong here based solely on how they look or where you assume they come from, that's unacceptable on our flights." Gasps rippled through the cabin. A woman in row 10 whispered, "Finally someone said it." Patricia's cheeks flushed crimson. Her mouth opened and closed, but words caught in her throat. The eyes of the passengers burned into her, their silence louder than applause. And through it all, Daniel stood there, still, calm, composed. His face gave nothing away except that quiet patience, as though he had been waiting for this exact moment. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply stood, watching, knowing. Patricia tried to recover, her voice breaking as she sputtered. You can't accuse me of discrimination. I was only stating facts, statistics. Children like him don't..." She stopped herself too late. Her own words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to take back. Several passengers groaned in disgust. One man shook his head in open disbelief. James's voice dropped lower, colder. "Ms. Coleman, I would advise you to choose your next words very carefully." The weight of his warning pressed against her chest. But before she could answer, Daniel's voice cut softly through the tension. "Mr. Morrison," he said, his tone calm, his eyes fixed on the supervisor, "I think it's time." Patricia's heart lurched at those words. Time for what? And for the first time since she boarded the plane, a chill of real fear slipped down her spine. The cabin was silent, charged with a tension so sharp it seemed to vibrate in the air. Patricia Coleman's pulse hammered in her ears, though she forced her posture to remain regal, her chin lifted in stubborn defiance. She clutched the armrest of seat 9A as though her grip alone could anchor her control over the situation. Daniel, however, did not move closer, did not raise his voice. He simply stood in the aisle, his backpack hanging against his small frame, his dark eyes steady. There was no malice in them, no childish tantrum, only calm, only patience. The patience of someone who knew time was his ally. "Ma'am," Daniel said softly, his tone polite but edged with something sharper. "May I ask you a question?" Patricia scoffed, her laugh brittle. A question. What could a 9-year-old possibly have to ask me? The boy tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Do you believe some people are born better than others? The words struck like a stone dropped in still water, rippling across the cabin. Passengers shifted in their seats, their attention caught by the boy's quiet voice. Patricia's smirk faltered, just for a moment. Well, she stammered, regaining her composure, it's not about being better. It's about reality. Social structures exist for a reason. People need to know their boundaries. Daniel nodded slowly, as though he were absorbing every word. So, you think a child like me, someone with my skin, my age, cannot belong in a place like this? The trap was invisible, but it was closing. Patricia didn't see it. She laissed and forward, emboldened by her own arrogance. Statistically speaking, no. It's very unlikely. Children like you don't have families that can afford seats like these. It's just how the world works. Gasps rose again, sharper, louder than before. The businessman across the aisle shook his head in disbelief. A young woman in row 8 whispered, "She really said that?" But Daniel only stood taller, his eyes never leaving Patricia's. So all of this, he said quietly, everything you've said to me since I boarded this plane was never about rules or mistakes. It was about what you see when you look at me. Patricia opened her mouth, but no words came. Her throat felt dry, her palms slick against the armrest. The cabin had turned against her now. She could feel it, the judgment in every glance, the disgust in every silence. Even the flight attendants stood rigid, their expressions tight, as though they too were waiting for the inevitable. James Morrison, the supervisor, watched with careful eyes. He saw what was happening, the way the boy's calm questions were pulling the truth out of Patricia's own mouth, like threads unraveling a garment. He had seen lawyers try to do the same thing in corporate disputes, but never had he seen it done with such grace, and never by a child. Daniel's voice broke through again, softer this time, almost gentle. My mother told me once that people reveal who they truly are when they think no one important is watching. Do you believe that, ma'am? Patricia's lips trembled. She wanted to answer. She wanted to dismiss him. But something in his eyes, something far older than 9 years, held her still. Her silence was damning. Passengers leaned back, their gazes heavy with judgment. The balance of power had shifted completely, and Patricia knew it. She was no longer the woman in control of the situation. She was the one on trial, her arrogance laid bare in front of dozens of witnesses. Daniel didn't smile. He didn't. To gloat, he simply stood there, waiting, his silence louder than anything Patricia could muster. And for the first time in years, Patricia Coleman felt small. The tension in first class felt almost unbearable now, every passenger leaning in, watching as if the very air depended on what would happen next. Patricia Coleman sat frozen in seat 9A, her earlier confidence draining like sand through her fingers. Her cheeks were flushed, her throat tight, but her pride still whispered that she could claw her way back if she held firm. She smoothed her skirt and forced her voice steady. "This has gone far enough," she snapped, though the edge in her tone trembled. "Captain, supervisor, this entire cabin is being inconvenienced by a simple mistake. Remove this boy. I've been patient, but this is absurd." Her words rang hollow. No one nodded in agreement. Instead, she felt the weight of disapproval pressing against her from every direction. Then Daniel, who had been silent for long moments, shifted his backpack higher onto his shoulders, his small hands clasped in front of him, his face calm, almost serene. When he spoke, his voice was low, but it carried. "Mr. Morrison," he said softly, turning to the supervisor with a composure that startled everyone listening. "I think it's time we call my father." The words cut through the air like a blade. Patricia's heart skipped. For an instant, she thought she'd misheard. She gave a sharp laugh to mask her unease. "Your father? And who exactly is your father supposed to be? A mechanic? A porter? Perhaps a charity donor who pulled strings to get you here?" Her words drew groans from several passengers, disgust written openly across their faces. But James Morrison didn't flinch. Without hesitation, he reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. Patricia's stomach twisted when she saw how quickly he scrolled to a saved contact. "Mr. Thompson," James said into the receiver, his tone shifting into a respect so deep it sent chills through the cabin. "Yes, sir. Your son is here on the flight to Miami. He would like to speak with you." The businessman across the aisle sat straighter, his eyes widening. Passengers began to murmur. A ripple of shock moved through the cabin like a silent wave. Patricia's mouth went dry. Mr. Thompson, the name echoed in her head with a terrible familiarity. Surely not. Surely it couldn't mean. James handed the phone to Daniel with both hands, his posture almost reverent. The boy accepted it quietly, lifting it to his ear. His voice, still steady, carried enough for everyone in the front rows to hear. "Hi, Dad. Yes, I'm fine. But something happened." He glanced toward Patricia, his eyes steady. "There's a woman here who said people like me don't belong in first class. She told me my mother should have taught me to know my place." A hush fell so deep it seemed the entire plane held its breath. On the other end, even through the faint static of the call, a strong male voice rose, tight with controlled fury. "Did someone say that to you, son?" Patricia's chest constricted. That voice, it wasn't the voice of a porter or a mechanic. It was the voice of someone used to commanding rooms, companies, lives. "Yes, Dad," Daniel said softly. She said it over and over. "Put her on the phone," the voice commanded. Patricia recoiled, shaking her head instinctively. No, this is ridiculous. I don't need to speak to anyone. This is all a misunderstanding." But James Morrison stepped forward, his expression firm. "Ms. Coleman, when the majority owner of this airline requests a conversation, it isn't optional." The words crashed into Patricia like thunder. Majority owner. The blood drained from her face. Her fingers tightened on the armrest, her knuckles white. She turned slowly toward the boy, her voice trembling. Your father." Daniel's gaze was calm, almost gentle. "Yes, ma'am. My father is Michael Thompson. He owns this airline." Patricia felt the floor vanish beneath her. The cabin seemed to spin, the passengers' eyes burning into her like spotlights. Every cruel word she had spoken replayed in her head, each one now a noose tightening around her neck. And in that moment she realized with bone-deep terror that she hadn't just humiliated a child, she had insulted the son of the man who controlled the very plane she sat on. Patricia's hand trembled as the phone was extended toward her. For a fleeting moment she thought about refusing, thought about standing on pride and walking away from the entire humiliation. But the eyes, dozens of them, burned into her from every angle. She could feel the cabin leaning in, waiting, holding their breath for the inevitable. Her fingers, cold and weak, reached for the device as though it were a blade rather than a phone. "Ms. Coleman," the voice on the other end spoke, deep and measured, carrying the weight of authority sharpened by fury. "This is Michael Thompson. I understand you've had quite a lot to say to my son." Her mouth went dry, her chest tightened. "Mr. Thompson, I didn't realize, if I had known who he was." "Oh," the voice cut in, cold and unyielding. "So you only give children respect when they have powerful parents? That's your defense?" The question sliced her like glass. The passengers around her stiffened. Someone muttered, "Good for him." Patricia swallowed hard, her throat burning. "No, sir, that's not what I meant. I've been misunderstood. I contribute to social causes. I have black friends. I would never—" "Stop!" Michael's voice dropped lower, and it was worse than shouting. It was the kind of tone that froze the blood, the kind of tone that made you realize excuses were dust. "My son recorded every word you said, every insult, every time you told him he didn't belong, every time you told him his mother should have taught him to know his place. It's all there. His phone is connected to our family's security system. I heard everything." The phone shook in Patricia's grip. The world spun. She glanced desperately around the cabin, searching for a friendly face, but all she saw were eyes filled with disgust, disappointment, and judgment. The weight of her own words pressed against her, crushing. "Mr. Thompson, please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It was a mistake, a terrible mistake. I was frustrated. I didn't mean any harm. I can make this right. I can donate. You cannot buy back dignity," Michael snapped. "You cannot pay your way out of this. What you tried to strip from a 9-year-old child is priceless. And what you've shown this entire cabin is who you truly are when you believe no one important is watching." Tears stung Patricia's eyes, but she blinked them back, desperate to keep her mask from cracking completely. "Please, I'm begging you, don't ruin me over this. My career—" "Your career?" Michael's voice hardened into steel. "You destroyed that yourself the moment you opened your mouth to humiliate a child. I won't lift a finger. The world will handle the rest when it hears how you behaved on my airline." Her chest collapsed in on itself. She tried to breathe, but the air felt thin. The passengers' stares burned hotter, closer. Even the captain stood still, his face grim, his silence louder than condemnation. Michael's tone softened only slightly, but it was more chilling than fury. "My son handled himself with dignity, something you couldn't manage with all your years and experience. He doesn't need revenge. He doesn't need to humiliate you further. The truth is enough, and the truth will follow you long after this flight is over." Daniel's calm eyes met hers as she handed the phone back with shaking hands. The boy accepted it gently, lifting it to his ear. "Dad," he said softly, "I'll handle the rest. Thank you. Of course, son, Michael replied. I'm proud of you. The line went quiet. Daniel lowered the phone, then turned back toward Patricia. For a moment, the silence in the cabin was suffocating. Then he spoke, his voice low, almost tender, though it cut sharper than any blade. My mother did teach me to know my place, he said. And my place is here, wherever I have a right to be. My place is to treat people with dignity, no matter what they think of me. You tried to take that away from me, but you couldn't. You only revealed yourself. Patricia broke then, the dam collapsing. Her tears spilled hot and fast, her shoulders shaking. The humiliation wasn't just public, it was absolute. Daniel turned away, finally sliding into seat 9A as if nothing extraordinary had happened. He pulled a book from his backpack, opened it quietly, and began to read. And Patricia Coleman, once so sure of her power, sat frozen in her seat, realizing she had been undone not by wealth, not by status, but by the dignity of a child who refused to bow to cruelty. The jet roared down the runway that day, but Patricia Coleman barely heard it. She sat hollow and stiff, her body trembling with the echo of Michael Thompson's words. Every whisper, every disgusted stare from the passengers around her pressed against her like iron weights. Across the aisle, Daniel sat calmly in 9A, his small frame leaning against the leather seat as he flipped through the pages of his book. It was as though nothing had happened, as though he hadn't just dismantled her entire sense of superiority with nothing but patience and truth. Hours later, when the plane touched down in Miami, Patricia walked through the airport in silence, her head bowed. She could feel eyes on her. Whether they truly were or not, it didn't matter. She felt marked, exposed. The recording Daniel had made wasn't just a private humiliation. She knew it. Deep down, she knew the words she had spoken would not remain locked inside that plane. They would spread. And once they spread, there would be no undoing them. She was right. Within days, the clip surfaced online. A shaky recording from another passenger captured everything. The dismissive laugh, the cruel comments, the devastating moment when the boy revealed who his father was. Social media lit up in outrage. News outlets replayed the footage. Headlines screamed her name alongside words like racism, discrimination, and humiliation. The internet was merciless. Her phone rang nonstop in the first 48 hours, not with support but with condemnation. Coleman Associates, the consulting firm where she had built her career for over 2 decades, announced they were terminating her contract. Clients cut ties immediately. Even friends she had once boasted about at cocktail parties stopped answering her calls. Patricia's name had become poison. 6 months later, Patricia lived in a modest apartment far from the elegant neighborhood she once called home. The Hermes handbag she had so proudly displayed on that flight sat in her closet, untouched, like a relic of another life. She worked part-time at a local nonprofit now, not because she wanted to, but because it was the only place that would take her. It was unpaid, humbling work, sorting donations, folding clothes, cleaning floors. Yet for the first time in her life, she was beginning to feel the sting of the words she had so carelessly thrown at others. One evening after a long shift, she admitted during a court-ordered therapy session, "I destroyed an innocent child's dignity because I couldn't bear the thought that he belonged where I thought only I did. And in the end, I destroyed myself." While Patricia's world collapsed, Daniel's quietly blossomed. His story spread far beyond the internet. Schools began using the incident as a teaching example in programs about respect and dignity. Teacher, as told their students about the 9-year-old boy who faced down cruelty without anger, who held his ground with patience until the truth revealed itself. Thompson Aviation announced a sweeping campaign for zero tolerance against discrimination. Training programs were introduced in every major airport under the company's name, and Daniel, though still a child, became a symbol. His face, calm and composed in the face of humiliation, reminded adults and children alike that dignity was the most powerful weapon against hate. On his 10th birthday, surrounded by family and friends, Daniel asked his father a quiet question. "Do you think Miss Coleman learned anything?" Michael Thompson studied his son, pride shining in his eyes. "What do you think, Daniel?" Daniel paused, thoughtful, his voice steady. "Mom used to say people only change when they know how it feels to be treated badly. Maybe now she understands. Maybe now she knows." Michael placed a hand on his son's shoulder, smiling faintly. "And that's why you're stronger than she'll ever be." That night, as Daniel blew out the candles on his cake, he didn't make a wish for revenge or triumph. He wished for something else, that no child would ever again be told they didn't belong. And somewhere across town, In a quiet apartment far from the life she once flaunted, Patricia Coleman sat alone, haunted not by the power of Michael Thompson or the wealth of his family, but by the calm, steady eyes of a 9-year-old boy who had shown her the truth, that real strength is not measured by status, but by dignity that cannot be broken.